We're back with senior broadcast contributor for Yahoo Finance, Kevin Cirilli. And Kevin, you wanted to talk to us a little bit about China-U.S. policy.
Yeah.
Weigh in, spout off.
Well, look, I think from a broad standpoint, President Biden going to Arizona this week with Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo to tour a TSMC semiconductor chip manufacturing plant is a big, big deal. And I think, a lot of folks are wondering why. Well, when half of the global supply chain of the microchips comes from Taiwan at a Taiwan-backed company or headquartered company, TSMC. And now you've got a major U.S. plant being built from TSMC in Arizona on U.S. shore. That's a huge deal because it suggests that the supply chains for these microchips are going to be increasingly onshore to the United States and to strategic partners and allies in Europe. Now, everyone's like, well, wait. Is this an episode of the Jetsons? Like, what are you doing talking about microchips? There are 5 microchips in your phone. There are 100 or so in your laptop. There are several hundred in your airplane or car. Cars are now computers. And so and thousands in airplanes and spaceships. I say all of this because chips are the new oil. They're the DNA for modern life. And so when you have China, communist China, having such a dominant hold over the microchip marketplace, that has significant repercussions geopolitically. And so the U.S. took their eye off the ball. The United States invented the microchip out in Silicon Valley decades ago, before we were born. And suddenly now we've ceded the marketplace to other countries. And I think what this represents from the previous administration, as well as a continuation from this administration, is that the U.S. has woken up to that.
So what exactly is the threat here? Because it's not new news, to your point, that in this industry and many others, we've outsourced it overseas. But the supply chain crisis that was brought on by COVID has made people, I think, more cognizant of the ways that we are vulnerable in various capacities like this. So we saw this spotlighted with Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan a few months ago now, which was unprecedented in its scope. And everyone said, oh, she's going to try to start World War III. What actually is the pressure point here? What is the concern that our access to the chips in Taiwan are actually going to come
China moved the goalpost. Not Speaker Pelosi. China moved the goalpost. Because China, for decades, had said that they wanted to maintain the status quo between Taiwan, an incredibly important democracy and an island in the Indo-Pacific region, and with China. And the United States consistently, for decades, has maintained that. China's military drills, Xi Jinping's communist military drills in the Taiwan Strait, has forced the United States to wake up. Look no further than what happened with Vladimir Putin with his war with Ukraine, and how many U.S. businesses and companies were absolutely caught flat-footed as a result of the sanctions structure that the administration correctly put into place. And so now a lot of CEOs in the business community that I'm talking to with my 2 fellowships, as well as through Yahoo Finance, are literally waking up and saying, if Xi Jinping pulls a Putin with Taiwan, what impact will that have, not just from a human rights perspective, but from an economic perspective here in the United States? Look, progressives as well as conservatives would agree that China has stolen intellectual property, has not played by the fair share of the rules, and have stolen U.S. jobs for decades. And so, I think when I talk to folks on both sides of the aisle, there has to be more of a focus on this. I was struck to see that Republicans and Democrats agreed to allow for there to be more financial assistance for Taiwan to defend itself or to maintain the status quo. And then separately, Xi Jinping backed down. You saw this when he kept pushing for these draconian zero COVID measures. And even in a communist country, you had protesters. And so saying that this was not going to be the case. Let me finish, because this is important. It's important that we all want human rights. Trust me, I want equality. But you can't just push for that here in the United States and turn a blind eye to it in communist countries.
So there's a lot of parts of that. Yeah. One, I don't want to get into a debate about it right now, but to me, the fact of China being communist is not material to this at all. Countries have self-determination. They can have whatever economic structure that they want. And it's not clear to me that that's like helping getting to the root of the conversation here. What the issue is whether or not there are national security interests and supply chain interests and having more things being especially key key products being manufactured at home. And you characterize that as China stealing American jobs. A lot of Americans would point out that it is a union of corporate interests who are trying to make more pennies on the dollar that have allowed so many jobs and supported trade deals that allowed so many American jobs to be outsourced to other parts of the world, where corporations exploit the lower quality of living and the absence of certain human rights protections, et cetera, elsewhere. And so now to be kind of beating the drum of war, as some conservatives actually are in this moment, and escalating tensions with, significant world powers, and the way that's been done.
Some conservatives and many Democrats.
And some Democrats, absolutely. Without taking responsibility for one's own trade practices and choice to exploit profit rather than keep jobs at home seems a little bit two-faced. Not to say that ultimately it is not advantageous to wake up to the fact that we absolutely should be building more of these things on American shores. But what do you make of people who might say, well, I voted for Trump because I appreciated that he was critical of NAFTA and critical of the bipartisan support for the trade deals that put us in this situation to begin with?
Well, no one wants war. No one wants war. But look at the Xinjiang province of China and look at the world's largest Apple iPhone production plant. And when you have thousands of workers walking out because of the horrible zero COVID policies and the restrictive policies that communist China has imposed on these people, that is going to have significant repercussions. I would argue that, what's happening this week right now is Xi Jinping's meeting with MBS in Saudi Arabia. And the dynamic of, I think, Putin's dance with Ukraine, war with Ukraine, and Xi Jinping now, I think the world has woken up. And the polls suggest the polls suggest that I think it's above 90% backs NATO. And I think there's an understanding.
Wait a minute, 90% of who? Because I'll tell you what,
Americans.
None of the global South, the majority of the world is not supportive of America's position with respect to Russia. It feels as though NATO expansion was an unwarranted provocation, and it's the global South that is going to have to deal with the consequences of the supply chain crisis that it caused them to have to face hunger, starvation, and a lack of energy supply. There is, I think, a lack of reckoning with America's role in it, despite obviously it being an unjust war and not, in an invasion of a sovereign territory. But a lot of people say if you want things like this not to happen going forward, including in China, you have to be cognizant of the ways that America has maneuvered in the international sphere to, frankly, ignore what was an obvious provocation in the years leading up to these kinds of events. Moreover, and it does seem to be, again, only half the story to complain about conditions in China with respect to zero COVID and ignore the fact that the very reason there are Apple factories in China in the first place is because these companies want to exploit the low pay and the standard of living that they don't have to support there because of the absence of the labor rights that we have in the United States of America. So if Apple doesn't want zero COVID, it didn't just show up in China because of the goodness of its heart and it wanted to provide Chinese jobs. Apple chose to exploit that system, and now we're turning around and saying, oh, China's the bad guy and Apple has no responsibility here for the choice to go to a country where it could profit from having those kind of low worker standards?
Look, I think it's the one area of bipartisanship in the new Congress that's going to make significant headway. I think that Republicans and Democrats would agree that, especially right now in this new era, that this is the one area where if Xi Jinping is not addressed in a way where he is going to be held for keeping the status quo, keeping peace, and not doing these military drills, not war sabering or warmongering as his actions have done, in addition to oppressing Muslim minorities in his own country. I think the world has woken up, and I specifically think that based on my reporting, that a lot of progressive and conservative governments in the Europe as well as the Indo-Pacific region, I think increasingly African nations as well, are deeply skeptical of Communist Party of China's economic, human rights, and unfortunately military
maybe some
rhetoric.
of those nations could be places we could put plants to manufacture superconductors Or we had Peter Pitts on earlier this week, I believe, a former FDA commissioner, who said talking about the shortage of liquid amoxicillin, saying we could build it in Morocco. He named a bunch of countries where you could have plants that were not China, so you don't have the geopolitical threat issue. But also, I'm just very skeptical that we're going to wholesale bring back manufacturing to the city because they left for all the reasons you described.
Yeah, well, and you're seeing that with India, but
so they can make better and more
profit. That's fine, but to Kevin's initial point, when you have the interest in when a technology or a good like oil, whatever it is so crucial to the functioning of your economy, at a certain point, or COVID vaccines, whatever it is, when it will be a national crisis for you not to have X, Y, or Z, at a certain point, some countries might say that there's a trade-off between the profit motive and being able to protect oneself in the middle of a pandemic or any other kind of crisis. And having a certain degree of manufacturing of, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's having stockpiles and reserves, whatever it is in the national interest. And
but then would you say suspending all the regulations that make it that shrink the ability for profit because you have to do all the sorts of labor standards and environmental protection and the reason it takes so long to build and do everything here because we have all these baked-in government requirements that you don't have in other places. That's why they go elsewhere. Would you suspend those if it's so important?
The place I would start is the actual profit, which is to say that corporate greed and the extent to which people are making these kind of decisions, not because it's impossible to manufacture
you just can't legislate out the profit motive.
You absolutely can, and you've done many war posture moments in American history.
I respect the progressive and the conservative debate here, and look, and you guys know I'm a nonpartisan journalist, but I will say that my bias is I believe in democracy, and I do want to own that. And so with that said, in the financial conversation, there's a lot of conversation about decoupling from China. Well, what we're witnessing in the trend, based on all of the analysis and the previous administration continuing into this, which in many ways has gone further on a thing called reverse CFIUS with giving it more bite but not to get too in the weeds, we're seeing tech decoupling. And I think the notion is that I totally respect your right to say what you said, but in communist China, you couldn't criticize the communist government on their platforms. They stifle freedom of speech. And so the question becomes, especially on tech, when these microchips, for example, are made all around the world, they're not just built in one place. Who has access to that data? Do you want a society that believes in freedom of speech, that believes in voting rights, that believes in, and I'm not saying we're perfect because it's been a humbling time to be an American, let's be honest, but do you want that, or do you want a society that doesn't have respect for that? And I think that's the biggest question of our era.
Sure, and those are decisions that Americans can make, and they can choose to build these facilities at home or in more friendly countries. But it is not an excuse, and I think there's a lot of people are concerned about, and that what we've talked about on this show, Robby, it is not an excuse to instigate global conflict with other world powers. You see the difference? Going to war with China because of saying they have human rights abuses and all of these justifications. At the same time, you brought up MBS earlier in China's relationship. A U.S. court just said MBS was off the hook for the murder of Khashoggi. Joe Biden said he was going to make him a pariah and instead has made him his best pal.
That was before we needed him.
That's before we needed him, exactly. So I don't know. Like, those kind of excuses seem to be weak justification for all kinds of militarism and interventionism that we wouldn't support, even though I think some of the fundamental concerns are perfectly valid. Look, it's such a pleasure talking to you about all of this.
Talk about geopolitics.
So today the viewers got not just 2 stridently different takes, but I think 3 stridently different takes.
Hey, you know what? Only here on the Hill TV.
Thank you for joining us, Kevin.
Anytime.
We'll be back.
Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. More Rising after this.